Xandr Kasko had been in bad situations before. Inevitable, really, in his line of work. But this went beyond even his usual screw-ups. At least they'd removed the chains. Their mistake. He sat back against the stone wall, letting the ever-present chill soak through his thin prison uniform. After a month of this, he'd almost forgotten warmth. But once that happened, he'd truly be out of hope. And he was going home. One way or another. Home to his ship. Home to his crew. He just had to find a way out. Sound clattered down the hall, commotion and cacophony that made his ears ring and headache. He wanted to shrink into himself. Doing it in his cell, in full view of the rest of the prisoners, would be suicide. He didn't need to be a hardened criminal to know that weakness equaled death in a place like this. Not that he'd spent much time in a cell. His misspent youth made that highly unlikely. And he was normally better at his job. But he couldn't regret the murder. There was one fewer scumbag in the universe thanks to him. Exilta should have given him an award. Though it wasn't like they didn't have another reason to lock him up. Stealing jewels tended to make governments a bit upset. He heard laughter and the clank of armor as guards rounded the corner, their steps echoing off the moss-damp walls. He tensed, wishing he had any place to run. Or hide. He wasn't a coward. But a smart man knew when it wasn't time to fight. 1 man against 5 guards? Xandr knew his limits. The guards stopped in front of his cell, their faces expressionless under the light of their visors. One stepped forward and let his hand hover over the locking mechanism. With a faint click, the lock disengaged and the door slid open. The guard gestured for him to move. Not good. So not good. Something was definitely off here. The roaring from the prisoners got louder as Xandr let himself be led by his escort. One bumped him in the shoulder and made him stumble forward into the guard leading him. That guard swung around and backhanded him so swiftly that he tripped and fell. At least his crew couldn't see him. This was an especially degrading humiliation. In another life he would have had a quip, would have said something to make the guards angry enough to make a mistake. But that only worked when he had an exit strategy. The guard who'd slammed his blaster into him helped him up with a level of professionalism you didn't normally see in prison. Something crumpled against Xandr's hand and was gone as quickly. Until he felt the guard's fingers slide over his pocket. Then he was standing on his own like nothing happened. Xandr was tempted to reach into his pocket and see what the guard had given him, but he had enough experience at clandestine handoffs to keep his hands empty. The hall terminated with another door. The lead guard swiped a keycard and entered an arena. The smell hit Xandr first. Unwashed bodies. Sand. Blood. He'd been sitting in a cage for a month and hadn't realized he'd been only meters away from a killing field. And freedom. It wasn't clear at first glance, but when he looked around and saw the clustered prisoners, all wearing the same uniforms, all with the same half-strangled hope in their eyes, he knew that had to be the prize tonight. One of the guards shoved him into a small holding cell with 3 other prisoners. One Oscavian like him, another alien he couldn't identify but who had 3 eyes and tentacles, and a blue alien with dark markings dotting his skin. Like him, none of them were native to Exilta. Then again, Exilta imported most of its citizens. These fellow prisoners could be residents. Or they could be criminals passing through. His first view of the arena had overwhelmed him, but now that he had a moment, he saw it was much less impressive than he first thought. It was little more than a sunken room with a few metal walls, less than 10 meters tall at most. The sand-covered floor was patchy with crusted blood and other fluids. And though he'd been blinded by a light the moment he stepped into the room, once his eyes adjusted he could spot the deep shadows and dark corners. The only audience was the off-duty guards, ringed around a balcony and sneering at them from a safe distance. They were here for their amusement. And if freedom truly was on offer, Xandr wondered how much it would cost. And how long it would last. He could imagine the deaths a place like this had seen. Violence and despair choked the air. If he had more time and his crew, he could. But no, he had to focus on his own survival first. He'd helped plenty of people over the course of his career. Now it was time to help himself. When more than a few minutes had passed and the passel of guards who'd brought him had wandered away, Xandr slipped a hand into his pocket for the crumpled piece of paper. The prize is a trap. Blind spot in east wall of the courtyard. Win and run. Rendezvous as planned. Kina. It had to be here. His second in command had escaped Exilta with the surviving members of his crew the moment he was captured. It was the standing procedure, but he wondered if she'd had to hold anyone back. His permanent crew was like family. But for their own safety, they'd had to get out of Exilta's orbit. And now that the dust had settled, they were back and giving him the shot he needed to get away. That was the reason despair had never swallowed him whole. No matter what abuses the guards inflicted on him, no matter how cold the cell, or whatever other indignities he had to face, he had absolute faith that his people would come for him. But it took them long enough. And quote, listen up, you miserable excuses for beings. And quote, the person speaking wasn't a guard. And quote, the prison of Exilta is granting you one shot at freedom. Quarterly trial day begins tomorrow, and execution's 2 days after that. One of you sacks of garbage will make it out of here alive. The rest of you face Exiltan justice. And quote, a guffaw rippled through the sneering guards. Justice. Here. What a joke. Kina must have paid hefty bribes to get the note to him, and Xandr wouldn't waste the opportunity. He glanced around at the prisoners surrounding him, and wondered how many more he'd have to kill to live another day. And quote, you want your freedom, you enter the melee, and quote, the presenter kept speaking. And quote, you fight until you fall or flee. Cross the red line and you're out. Fail to get back up after a fall and you're out. Kill anyone and you're out. And quote, the spectating guards grumbled at that last instruction and the presenter turned to them. And quote, do you really want to do the paperwork, boys? And quote, that got a laugh going. It made winning harder. Though, perhaps, morally he should consider the escape easier. Xandr didn't relish killing. It was unavoidable on some missions. But when he killed, he wanted it to be because his opponent had done something to warrant it. He didn't know these other prisoners. And that meant their deaths wouldn't add to his nightmares.